So inevitably, at some point, that question does come up. Okay, what is my vocation? What do I do? We all have a place in the divine economy of God. So how do we figure out where that is? And it's not always immediately obvious to us. And from my understanding, the church, broadly speaking, kind of blesses two ways of life. There's marriage, and then there's monasticism. So do you have any advice for people trying to discern that path if they're kind of in that position where they're like, I could go either way? How should people go about discerning that?
That's a great question. I'd answer it to begin with, with the same sort of disclaimer of talk to your spiritual father about this, because really we cannot make these decisions on our own. We really need the advice and perhaps also of other trusted, spiritual people who know us, whose lives we admire. We can also ask their opinion about these things, but of course, mainly our spiritual father. But with that said, as far as these two paths, you're right about that. There's also another saying, which is that there are three paths towards sanctity in the Orthodox Church. There's marriage, monasticism, and martyrdom. Of course, martyrdom in its formal sense isn't something that most of us are necessarily in imminent encounter with. But at the same time, and I forget who said this, but I think it's quite true. If you take that saying, that there's those three paths, marriage, monasticism, and martyrdom, that ultimately there's only one path, and that's martyrdom. And that really marriage and monasticism are both merely different forms of martyrdom. And I think this is a very important way for us to look at our lives. And first of all, let me back up a little bit and say, okay, well, maybe that sounds a little bit morbid, but we have to remember that the word martyrdom, what it means is witness. That the martyrs, were not primarily defined by the fact that they died. They were primarily defined by the fact that they witnessed to their faith, to the power of their faith, the meaning of their faith, the depth of their love for God, in such a way that they showed that nothing else in the world meant anything compared to that. That was the witness that they made. That was what made them holy. I mean, just dying doesn't make you holy, and so that. But of course, with that said, it's impossible to make a true Christian witness without sacrifice, because Christ's sacrifice on the cross was the ultimate revelation of who he is. And so if we truly believe in theosis and deification and union with Christ, that really to be completely united with Christ and to be, again, no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, this will inevitably result in a life characterized by sacrificial love, because that's who God is. That's who Christ is. That's what holiness is. But so we need to look at whatever specific vocation, calling, future that we may have in that light, of not just, what's going to fulfill me, what's going to make me happy, what's going to make the best use of my talents and abilities. Of course, I'm not saying don't ask those questions at all, but none of those are really the ultimate criteria. The ultimate criteria is what is going to bring me into the closest union with Christ possible. So, when people here at the monastery are novices, so, for those of you who may not be familiar, there's different stages of the monastic life. And really, for most people, they're not going to take their final vows to be a monk forever until usually at least 6 or 7 years after they first come to the monastery. But the first stage in that sort of progression towards making your vows, your permanent vows as a monk, is what's called the novitiate, where you're, and again, canonically and typically this lasts for 3 years, but different monasteries do it a little bit differently. In any case, those first 3 years when you're a novice, you've made no formal commitment, you've made no vows, you're living the monastic life as fully as possible, but you're in this period of discerning, is this what God's calling me to or not? It's a period of testing and of discernment and of getting to know what is this life really like day in and day out. And so, far from being forbidden, it's encouraged for novices to consider, should I stay or not? And so for me, when a novice comes to me and asks, it's a difficult thing to discern because, of course, there's always going to be temptations to go back to the world. Even if someone has a true and sincere monastic vocation, of course, the demons are going to fight against this. They're going to try and whisper this reason and that reason to give it up, and to abandon it. And it can be very confusing because they can oftentimes tell half truths. They can say things that, sound very pious, even. Like, for example, this is a common temptation that I've also encountered personally, speaking to novices, this thought of, okay, I've been taught so many things about the spiritual life here at the monastery. I should go out and share these, with other people. I should share these riches of the faith that I've learned about here with people who've never heard about it, because these things are so beautiful and meaningful. I need to share these with others, So again, it sounds very pious, but it's also very easy for this to merely be a cloak for our pride of, I've become a spiritual person now. Now I can go and really show other people, how the spiritual life is really supposed to be lived. So it's tricky. So, but basically, what I tell them first and foremost when they're considering, should I stay at the monastery or should I go back to the world? All these other concerns, thoughts, ideas, reasons, motivations, lay all of them aside at first and simply ask, do I want to go back to the world because I sincerely believe that that's where I will find Christ, or not? If there's some other motivation, whatever other motivation, no matter how good it might be in and of itself, if the primary reason isn't to seek Christ, then it's probably a temptation. It's probably a distraction. We need to have, again, to go back to the parable of the rich young man, and this is for everybody, not just for monks, the question we should always be asking is, how can I be saved? Not just how can I be saved, but, how can I become perfect? What does Christ say? Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Of course, we all fall extremely short of this ideal, and it's not about, some sort of legalism or some sort of, guilt trip, if we have any kind of failure. But the point is, we should all be striving more than anything else in our lives to be with Christ, to be with God. And all the decisions that we make about how to live our lives should be based in, in this framework of what's going to help me to be with God. So if if at the monastery, and, again, not everyone is supposed to be a monk. Sometimes people come here and they just get so, weighed down with the, with the asceticism or whatever else it might be, that it ends up separating them from God. And that's not good. That's a pretty good sign that you don't have a monastic vocation. Our abbot will sometimes say that, none of us could live this life even for a day if the grace of God wasn't there helping us to do it. But really, that's true. That's true of any life. That's true of the Christian life in general. It's very, very difficult, of course. It's also very joyous, but it can only be done with God's grace. And so if God manifestly isn't giving us the grace to do something, then again, that's a good consideration that maybe it's because he wants us to do something else, But so to get back to the martyrdom specifically, as an example, or rather as a framework for making the decisions about monasticism or marriage, I really, and I'm a monk. I have never been married, so take this only for what it's worth. But it seems to me that the reason why so many marriages fail in our society around us is precisely because so many people, even Christians, aren't looking at it as a martyrdom. They're not looking at it as a way to sacrifice ourselves for that other person's salvation, for that other person's well-being, to bring that other person and our family to God. Instead, they're looking at it as a source of nice feelings, or a source of personal fulfillment, or, whatever it is. And so when those personal feelings go away, that sense of fulfillment goes away, and we feel, well, why should I even be married anymore? What's it doing for me? Because we don't look at that marriage fundamentally as an act of sacrifice, of loving self-sacrifice. We look at it as what am I getting out of it? This can happen with monasticism too. You can think, oh, I'm going to go there and I'm going to be filled with these lofty spiritual feelings and visions and consolations and all of these things. And then when that doesn't happen, we feel like, well, it's not working, because it's all about, what do I feel? What do I like? How does it seem to me? And so no matter what it is that we're undertaking, and of course we all have to struggle with this because it's in all of us, it's not like we're ever going to perfectly be rid of these things, but we have to at least be trying to look at any of these vocations fundamentally as how, is this the best way in which I can express love for Christ, for the church, for the people around me? Because that self-sacrificing love is the only way to truly find joy and peace and fulfillment and all these other, because the desire in itself isn't wrong. It's natural to want to feel peace, to feel a sense of purpose and meaning and self-satisfaction. But if we pursue those feelings as an end in and of themselves, that's where we get into trouble. But ultimately those desires will find their fulfillment in a true Christian life of love and self-sacrifice and prayer and all of these things. But we have to realize that, essentially, we can't get to the resurrection except by ascending the cross. And so, again, and this is something that for monastics, it can be sort of a rude awakening when, at a certain point, those first feelings of grace and consolation that so many people have when they enter the monastery, it goes away, and instead there's dryness and drudgery, and it becomes difficult to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning every single day and stand through a long church service and then go and do something that we don't really like, to work all day, next to people who maybe we don't get along with that well, and then it feels like, okay, well, this is a failure. Something's gone wrong. I'm not a good spiritual person because I don't have these good spiritual feelings, but that's, those periods really, and this is something that our abbot reminds us of over and over again, those are the times when we really have the chance to make the most progress, to really become true monks, to really become true Christians, because we're not getting anything out of it. It can be very easy to unconsciously become spiritual hedonists, and, I'll pray basically because I like the feelings that I get when I pray. And when I don't have those feelings, I think, well, my prayer is dry and a failure, and how can this please God? When really, sometimes those prayers are the most pleasing to God. When we don't feel like it, we don't want to, but we choose to make that offering of love to Him anyway. That can be extremely pleasing to Him. And like I said, it can really be an opportunity to grow tremendously as Christians, no matter what state of life that we're in. But as long as we have our focus all on ourselves, and what our own feelings are, what our thoughts are, what our own condition is, we're going to get way off track. It's like the priest who baptized me. He said it's the Christian life is kind of like driving. If you're driving along and your eyes are on the horizon, it's very easy to go straight along the road. Because you have your eyes on the goal. But if you look, right down in front of you at the road, and you're constantly going to be trying to swerve back and forth to stay in the lines and avoid this and avoid that, if everything's just right in front of you, you're not going to be able to go, smoothly and straight, towards the destination that you've chosen. So if we get so focused, on just how I feel right at this second, we're going to overcorrect this way and that way and all sorts of things. So again, this is another reason why spiritual fathers are so important, because they'll be able to say very easily that that's what we're doing. And they'll be able to say, no, the fact that your prayer is dry, that's fine. Just pray anyway, and God will accept that offering, and we can be reassured, but if we have to evaluate our own spiritual life, we'll get all sorts of wrong signals and misinterpret things. And, because we'll just ultimately be wrapped up in ourselves, that communion with God will be severed, which is the goal of all of it. All of our prayer, fasting, asceticism, church services, all of that. The point is to be with God, So anyway, I've now gone off on quite a tangent. I apologize.
That's all right. That's all right. So that's very good practical advice. I think for people like me who overthink, sometimes we can be like, okay, this might be my will, or this, how do we know if this is my will or this is God's will, or if this is what I think God wants me to do? How can we be sure that our will is in alignment with God's will when it comes to these things?
Well, for a monk, it's easy. We practice obedience. And so if our abbot, our spiritual father, tells us to do something, tells us this is the kind of spiritual discipline that you should be practicing, this one isn't, then we can be perfectly at peace, because even if he's wrong, objectively speaking, even if, for example, he tells us to do the work in a way that's subpar or something like that, from a spiritual point of view, it's far more important to be obedient than it is to be correct. Something that Saint Porphyrios, one of the recent saints from Greece, he said, I'd much rather be wrong in the church than right outside of the church, which is sort of a macrocosm, but on a practical level too, at the monastery, learning to not worry about whether I'm right or I'm wrong, but simply to be obedient for the sake of the love of Christ makes our lives so peaceful and so calm, because we can be assured, we're doing this for the sake of Christ. We're obeying the person that God has put over me. And that's all I need to worry about. I'm not responsible for making sure the entire world is being run in the best possible way, and so there's tremendous peace in that. It can, this practice of obedience is something that, for many of us, especially as Americans, can seem oppressive at the beginning. But I can tell you from my own experience that it's in fact tremendously freeing, because we're freed from the tyranny of whatever our own preference or opinion might happen to be about every little thing. And it's such a blessed relief to not have to decide every single thing for ourselves. But anyway, so for a monk, it's relatively easy to know what God's will is, because we have holy obedience. But for a lay person, obviously, that's not practiced to the same extent. I will say your first line of recourse, once again, should always be to ask your spiritual father's advice. He's not going to give you an obedience in the same way that a monastic superior is going to. But still, to bounce off, whatever you're thinking about, with your spiritual guide is going to be a tremendous help and blessing, because again, we can get in our own, like you said, in our own heads so easily, and get caught up in all these things that someone with an outside perspective, who's also a spiritual person, this will be able to enlighten many things that, before we spoke it out loud, seem like almost insoluble problems or something like that. The other thing that I would say, just as, by way of general advice about this, I would say, again, don't be so caught up in abstractions as much as possible. Look at what's practically possible. Look at the doors that Providence is opening in your life and the ones that Providence is closing in your life. If you really feel an intense desire to get married and you've done everything that you can for 20 years and it's just not happening, this is perhaps a sign that God is calling you to something different. Maybe not, it's not that you're usually going to get some, writing on the wall like Nebuchadnezzar, to tell you exactly what God's will is, but to simply observe the circumstances that Providence has arranged in your life is extremely important. And it can solve many things that seem like completely intractable problems when it just exists in our own head. Like Christ said, fundamentally, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. What was he talking about? He said, don't worry about what to eat or what to drink, what to be clothed with. You could say, by extension, what career path to go down. I mean, yes, we have to make decisions. It's not like you just sit back and do nothing. But I would say most importantly, make the decisions in front of you that day. Even this moment, do right now what makes the most sense. And, of course, you will get to certain junctures in life when you have to make some significant decisions, but you don't have to make those decisions until you get to those junctures, And I think a lot of times we can create, tremendous pressure on ourselves to decide all these things in advance that really these decisions aren't for right now. Our job is to, prepare for these things insofar as is reasonable today. But simply being grounded in the present moment rather than in what ultimately, unfortunately, a lot of times is simply our fantasies about the future. Just living in the real world, is going to give God the opportunity to speak to you in a way that he's not going to be able to speak to us when we're just wrapped up in our own thoughts and fantasies and projections and, all sorts of things like that.
As a follow-up to that, because you mentioned kind of the example in the monastic context, you just do what the abbot tells you, basically. You don't really have to think too much about it. But for lay people, we have spiritual fathers, but we don't follow spiritual fathers 100% in the way that like a monastic would follow right. The abbot. So how do we draw the line between, for lay people and that are not monastics, how do we draw the line and discern like when this is our maybe our spiritual father's best advice, which is good, and maybe when we should deviate from that? Not that we should be seeking to deviate from that, but how do we discern like where to draw that line of obedience?
Yeah. It's a great question. I'll say from the beginning, even for a monastic, there are times when you need to disobey your superior. Much more rarely, of course, but in cases, of heresy or schism or gross immorality or something like that, which of course usually doesn't happen. Unfortunately, from time to time, it might happen. But it's not like we're just supposed to, as monks, turn off, our brains and our souls and just become robots or something like that. I mean, obedience isn't about crushing, our own selves and just becoming a slave of something else. It's really obedience in its true sense brings out our true identities. It allows, the new man to flourish, unencumbered by the old man and all of our passions and all of our, the sinful accumulations that have enslaved our will. I mean, really, obedience is about getting rid of all of this enslavement to the fallen self, so that the true new creation in Christ will be able to live. That's the goal of a real spiritual father, not to just somehow order people around all of the day. But as far as, so along those lines, as far as the relationships between spiritual fathers and lay people go, in my opinion, a good spiritual father will give very few like absolute obediences to their spiritual children. I mean, obviously, it's their job to expound the faith to them. We don't have the right as Orthodox Christians to just decide whether or not we're going to believe, the church's doctrines about this or that or the other thing, as though it was like just a cafeteria style Protestantism or something like that. So when our spiritual father is telling us, this is an absolute teaching of the church, then obviously this calls us to obedience to it. This can apply to theological things, but also, to issues of morality and ethics and things like that. Not to say that there aren't, more gray issues or areas that are hard to discern within that, but there are certain things that simply, our spiritual father is going to tell us this isn't permitted for an Orthodox Christian to do, and we need to obey that. But if someone, if a layperson has a spiritual father who's telling them, you shouldn't buy a car unless I give you a blessing to do it or something like that, this is really, starting to become, almost kind of, maybe not outright spiritual abuse yet, but you're kind of going in that direction and could easily, fall into that territory for real. So I would hope that for most people, your question simply won't be an issue, that it'll be clear when the priest is speaking to them as the voice of the church, and it'll be clear when he's saying, this is my advice as someone who knows you and cares about you and loves you, but ultimately it's up to you. And if we're not sure, we can always ask or say, like, Father, are you giving me an obedience, or are you, giving me, your advice? And of course, even his advice is going to be important. We should take it seriously. But I would say, just as for a monk, in matters of morality or the faith, we should disobey when we've been told something contrary to the church. Similarly, I would say probably for lay people, those are, I don't want to put my foot in it because I haven't really thought this through very much, but my instinct would be to say that, like, outside of those matters of like strictly expounding the teachings of the church, there probably are going to be few situations where you're absolutely bound as a matter of obedience as a layperson to do what your spiritual father tells you to do.
I think asking the question is good. Is this an obedience or not? Because it may not be clear.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I mean, I've so rarely heard of any priest, who's giving. I mean, even something as involved in church life is, for example, whether a layperson is going to go to seminary and try to become a priest. Of course, you need a blessing to do that. But I mean, I've never heard of someone who was given an obedience to do that, who was told you have to do that.
Right. I think a lot of
freedom is so important in the Christian life.
A lot of people do kind of confuse when they're getting advice versus when they're getting an obedience. So,
yeah. So I mean, I think that really when we're talking about our spiritual disciplines, the way that we're practicing our spiritual lives, this is the area where, of course, obedience does have its place. But even then, a real, as I said before, real obedience isn't just about one person controlling another person. It exists in a context of trust and of love, and of mutual communication and openness. I mean, even with something like a prayer rule, a prayer rule is something that ultimately should come from our spiritual father, not be decided by ourselves, but we need to tell our spiritual father how it's going. If it's something that's just too much for us, or if we feel like, we're not growing, I mean, we talk to them about it and they take what we say into consideration. That doesn't mean that they just let us do whatever we happen to feel like, but they'll take it into consideration. And through a process of honesty and dialogue, and discernment, we'll come to something that will be spiritually productive for us. So, I mean, I guess ultimately, like, I can't give any rule about, right, you have to obey in this case and you should never obey in any other case. I mean, I would say, the most important thing in all of this is to have your spiritual father be someone that you trust, right? Because real obedience necessitates trust, and just to give your blind obedience to someone who you don't trust is a recipe for disaster. So find a spiritual father who, and again, for most people, it's going to be their parish priest, and that's fine and wonderful, because most parish priests that I've known are wonderful people. But what it comes down to is do you trust this person to tell you how to find Christ or not? If you trust them, then, usually you'll take the advice that they give, and they usually aren't going to try to strong arm you into something that's, totally superfluous to your salvation. I don't know if I've really, answered this well or talked about what you wanted me to talk about. I mean, these things
that helps. That helps for sure.
I guess just to close, I would say, like, if you're concerned that you've been given an obedience that's not reasonable, and it's a serious thing, talk to the bishop about it. I mean, we have bishops for a reason. Unfortunately, in America, we can sometimes get the feeling that they're just totally aloof, or something like that, and not part of our actual lives. But it's important to remember that, no priest has the authority to perform any of the mysteries on his own power. We're always acting as the hands of the bishop with his explicit, blessing and authorization. We're the agents of the bishop, basically. We don't have that, power in and of ourselves. To celebrate the liturgy, for example, or to hear confessions. We're always acting for the bishop. So if you feel like your priest is not behaving towards you properly, you have recourse. You have recourse to the mechanisms that the church gives to make sure that something unhealthy hasn't developed.